Welcome to This Explainer. I'm so glad you're joining us today because we're about to dive into something that could completely change how you look at inclusive education. If you're an educator, an administrator, or honestly, just someone passionate about learning, you already know that inclusion is a massive, complex topic. But today, we're cutting through the buzzwords and looking directly at the structural realities of our classrooms.
Think about it for a second. Who is your classroom really designed for? For decades, our educational systems have been built to cater to this mythical standard student. In that outdated model, diversity is kind of viewed as an exception, right? A disruption that requires special adjustments. But what happens when we flip that script entirely? Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll shift from adaptation to redesign. Second, we'll look at the anti-bias approach. Third, designing equitable assessments. Fourth, the ecosystem of inclusion. And finally, service learning in action. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, from adaptation to redesign, or as I like to call it, fixing the system, not the student.
So, there's a massive paradigm shift happening right now in education. The old way of thinking, the adaptive logic, it really focused on making specific little tweaks for individual students who didn't quite fit the mold. But here's the thing, research actually shows this can perpetuate exclusion and stigmatization. It kind of makes inclusion just a surface-level gesture. Redesign, on the other hand, shifts the focus completely away from fixing the student, and instead looks at how the educational environment itself is built. Diversity isn't some rare exception we have to manage, it's literally assumed from day one. It becomes a continuous, proactive process of finding and removing barriers to learning.
Which brings us to Section 2, the anti-bias approach, focusing on the internal lens. If we're going to redesign our classrooms, we have to start by looking in the mirror. We need to talk about implicit bias. These are the subtle, automatic prejudices that happen completely under the radar, usually without us even realizing it. And hey, we all have them. They're deeply wired into our social and institutional structures, and they invisibly guide our everyday teaching decisions. Take an activity like a privilege walk, for example. It's a real eye-opener because it shows how what feels completely normal to one person can actually be a massive privilege for someone else. The whole point of the anti-bias approach is building the critical awareness to actually spot those invisible inequities and intentionally fix them. So, how does this actually look in practice? Well, the source material highlights anti-racist pedagogy, which is anchored in critical race theory. This framework essentially argues that a colorblind approach can actually end up reinforcing existing inequalities. Instead, it explicitly places race and structural issues right at the center of the conversation. The scientific literature identifies a few core practices for this: developing critical consciousness, using counter-narratives to validate diverse experiences, maintaining really high expectations while explicitly acknowledging systemic barriers, and practicing constant teacher reflexivity. The ultimate goal outlined here is to dismantle the structural conditions that allow discrimination and empower every single student in the process. Moving right along to Section 3, designing equitable assessments, where we apply this inclusive mindset. Now, this is where things get really practical, especially with what is arguably the most rigid part of education. To push back against highly standardized tests, which, let's be honest, often favor students whose backgrounds already align with dominant institutional norms, Calensis and colleagues propose a diverse menu of assessment formats. We've got project assessments for interconnected tasks, performance assessments for process and problem solving, group assessments for collective teamwork, and portfolio assessments to capture an individual's unique experience. What's absolutely crucial here is the shift from summative assessments, which just stamp a final grade on a student, to formative assessments, where students proactively monitor their own growth while they learn. Let's bring this to life with a quick example of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. Imagine a single narrative assignment. First up, we have student Anna. Anna really prefers to organize her thoughts out loud. So instead of being forced to write a traditional essay, she records a brief, punchy audio presentation outlining the plot and sequence of events. Then there's student João. He's tackling the exact same narrative assignment, but João processes information very differently. He builds a highly visual graphic organizer. He maps out the whole story progression, highlighting the characters, the settings, and the major plot twists. And finally, student Rita takes a totally different route. She creates a series of really detailed sketches of the main scenes and adds descriptive notes to them. It's the exact same assignment for all three students, but we're seeing multiple means of expression. And this brilliantly illustrates the magic of inclusive assessment. Teacher Miguel isn't grading them on their ability to conform to one specific medium. Instead, he's looking at their intermediate products and assessing the essential concepts, things like narrative technique, descriptive clarity, and sequential coherence, across all of these different formats. By setting totally transparent criteria from the get-go, Miguel ensures he's grading the actual learning that took place, not just a student's ability to navigate a rigid, one-size-fits-all format. Which brings us to Section 4, the ecosystem of inclusion, where we zoom out. Drawing on Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, we have to realize that inclusion isn't just about what happens inside the four walls of a schoolroom. It's like a giant puzzle. At level 1, you have the micro level, the classroom. This is the daily teacher-student interactions, the lesson plans, and those assessments we just covered. But this classroom doesn't exist in a bubble. Right, so that classroom is actually nested within level 2, the institution. Think about it. A classroom simply cannot be fully inclusive if the school itself lacks an inclusive organizational culture. Teachers absolutely need structured support and rock-solid equity policies from their school leadership if they're going to foster high levels of well-being and success for their students. And if we zoom out even further, we hit level 3, societal and governmental policies. This is the big picture, the exosystem. These overarching societal structures and legal frameworks basically dictate the rules of the game, shaping our schools by promoting specific norms, values, and ideologies. Now, the source material points out that these macro-level frameworks can create some very real constraints on inclusion. We're talking about things like monolingual policies that restrict the use of languages other than the national one, strict migration or asylum rules, limited religious freedom, or even regions where non-heteronormativity is criminalized. The text acknowledges that under heavy constraints like these, full inclusion can sometimes feel more like a distant aspiration than an immediate reality. But acknowledging these limits honestly is a crucial part of understanding the whole ecosystem of inclusive education. It really highlights how teachers act as vital mediators between everyday pedagogical practice and these massive institutional realities. And finally, Section 5, Service Learning in Action, the final bridge. So how on earth do we connect our students to these broader, complex social contexts? Well, one powerful framework is service learning. Basically, this means combining academic learning objectives with organized community service. The real game changer here is that it targets actual needs that the community itself has identified, all while promoting deep critical reflection. It totally shifts the dynamic, turning learners from passive recipients of information into active, engaged contributors to society. There are 4 highly practical stages to make this happen: planning, implementation, evaluation, and dissemination. And you know what the glue is that holds this whole shebang together? Critical reflection. Reflection is absolutely key. It's the structuring element that ensures jumping into the community actually becomes a genuine site of learning rather than just a weekend volunteer gig. It takes theory, smashes it together with practice, and builds an incredible bridge between the school and the real world, shaping these learners' lives. Wow, we've covered a ton of ground today, haven't we? From confronting our own implicit biases to completely rethinking how we grade and bridging our classrooms out to the wider community. But redesigning an entire educational system, that starts with single, intentional steps. So I'm going to leave you with this one thought to chew on. What is one small redesign you will make in your classroom tomorrow? Seriously, think about it, plan it out, and put it into action. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep designing for inclusion.